to take a few moments to discuss what I consider to be my greatest mistake, both for myself as well as training clients. Now, I think that the big problem with that mistake is that during my career, I had the opportunity to work with some great genetic athletes. I mean, people who are at the top of the food chains when it comes to genetics. And I think myself, while not at the top of the genetic pool, I do have the capacity, or I had the capacity to tolerate a lot of training volume, a lot of punishment. And because of the people I got to work with and myself, I think I kind of lost perspective at one point of what worked for the normal person. And I think that the biggest mistake I made was doing too much volume, both myself as well as my client. I've always been the guy who has no skill, right? I played probably all sports possible when I was a kid, and to be honest, I sucked at pretty much all of them. I was a bad football player, an horrible baseball player. I couldn't skate when I played hockey. I tried golf, but I probably broke more cars than made birdies. So honestly, all through my childhood and teenage years, I always wanted to be a great athlete. That's actually why I started training with weights, because I figured, well, I have no talent, I will make up for it with harder work. So even when I was like 12 years old, I was doing like just holding that position while watching TV, during commercial breaks, during abdominals, stuff like that, just because I knew I needed something that would separate me from the rest. But that same attitude led me to many training excesses when I was younger. And at a point, I was able to handle it to some extent because I was young and I could tolerate it. But in retrospect, when I think about it, it really made me not progress as well as I should have. I mean, I reached a decent level, but what happened is that oftentimes I would have like a very good training period. I would gain like 15 pounds of muscle in 2 months, which is unusually high. But then, for the next 6 or 8 months, I would actually lose muscle. At the end of the year, I would still gain like 12 total pounds of muscle, which is pretty good. But I spent most of the year actually losing muscle. But if you compound that over the years, I was still able to add a decent amount of tissue as well as strength. But it was probably a fraction of what I could have accomplished, or it took me a lot longer to get there. Also, to be honest, I felt like crap pretty much all the time because I would just overload my nervous system. And I would just be a walking zombie. I mean, when I was in social setting, I could force myself to be functional. But at home, I was really the most unpleasant person to be around with. So really, when I think about it, I think the greatest mistake trainees make is doing too much volume. But it's a natural mistake when you're passionate about something. We all equate doing more with getting better results. I mean, if you work more hours, you'll get a bit bigger paycheck. If you study more, you get better grades. So we are programmed to look for doing more work. But I think with training, it's destructive. Really, when you think about it, you can either train hard or you can train long. And if you were to pick one of the two, training hard will be training long every single time. Not only that, recent studies, like a meta-analysis by Dr. Schoenfeld, has shown that frequency of training a muscle group is more important than volume when it comes to building muscle. So if you train using a very large volume per session, that muscle cannot be trained often, it won't recover. But it's more important to train it often than to train it a lot. So in my opinion, the biggest mistake natural trainees can make is do too much volume, because the quality of the training will be affected. Another point, right? You have to understand this. There's a big difference between training enhanced and like using performance-enhancing drugs and training natural. It's a completely different physiology. Somebody who's taking steroids, for example, doesn't need to trigger protein synthesis with training because the products do that artificially for that person. A natural trainee has to use the training session itself to trigger protein synthesis. And for that person, the more often he can train, the more he'll be in an anabolic state. So somebody who's using drugs, who is anabolic 24/7, doesn't need the same frequency to get maximum gains because he already is in a high protein synthesis state. Whereas if you're natural, you need to train each muscle more often to get the maximum growth because you're triggering that protein synthesis state. Now, the other thing you must remember is that cortisol is a hormone that will stop protein synthesis. First of all, because it puts the body in a catabolic mode, but also because it directly impacts mTOR as well as the myostatin gene. So if cortisol is elevated too much, it can actually stop, if not reverse, the protein synthesis you stimulated with your training. So if your goal as a natural athlete is to trigger protein synthesis as often as possible to keep it high all throughout the week, you can't afford to have a high level of cortisol at any point during the week. So you have to use methods that will trigger protein synthesis by training really hard. But you can't do a lot of volume, otherwise you burn much more glycogen. Why does cortisol increases during training? It increases not because it's stress. It increases because when you are in a stressful situation, when you have physical stress, the body needs to mobilize energy to fuel the muscles so that they can fight or flight the stress, the source of stress. So the fuel you need when training is glycogen, and cortisol is increased to release, to mobilize that stored glycogen. So the more glycogen you use, the more cortisol you need to produce. So the first step in avoiding excessive cortisol release is decreasing training volume. So since you're decreasing volume, you have to compensate by doing fewer sets but doing them harder. So you can trigger maximum protein synthesis during those few sets. But don't do lots of volume. Once the protein synthesis has been triggered, doing more and more volume will not trigger it more. It will only make the response slower by increasing cortisol. So if you are not gaining, the worst mistake to do is add more volume. And that's a natural reaction. I'm not progressing. I might not be training enough. So you start doing more work and you're digging your own grave. More volume is not the answer. More frequency and harder work is the answer. You want to trigger protein synthesis more often while having cortisol as low as possible. That's why also I believe in having carbs before training, carbs and amino acids before training, not after. Because if you have carbs available in your bloodstream when you're training, you don't need to mobilize what you have stored in your muscles. If you don't need to mobilize as much glycogen, you don't need to release cortisol because cortisol's role is to mobilize glycogen. If you have glucose available because you had some before training, then you will have a lower cortisol response to training. So if you have a lower cortisol response to training and you train hard, then you're going to have more muscle growth. So that's why I believe biggest mistake, not training a muscle frequently enough because you're doing too much volume.